Hello everyone, and welcome to a video where I will be comparing the Vorkosigan Saga and the Dresden Files. Now, I've slightly baited you with the title, because if you remember, I have done some versus videos where I gave series like points and determined which is better. And I will not be doing that with Vorkosigan and Dresden, although it ends up being very close if I do. And one day, if I do another live stream Q&A, someone can bully me into doing that on that live stream. But this is more that the title of something like a stylistic comparison between the Vorkosigan Saga and the Dresden Files, and why I think fans of both series should try the other. It just is a little wordy. So the purpose of this video is to say, my fellow fans of the Dresden Files, can I introduce you to the Vorkosigan Saga? And also, at the exact same time, my fellow fans of the Vorkosigan Saga, can I introduce you to the Dresden Files? So for those of you who are like, who the hell is this guy? I read the Dresden Files 12 years ago for the first time, and I finished the Vorkosigan Saga 2 days ago. So Dresden has been my comfort read. I've read it a lot of times, and it has been the only thing that scratched that itch. Like, it's had a very specific corner of my brain that is like, Dresden is in that corner. And Vorkosigan is now also in that corner of my brain. They are, to me, in terms of style and appeal, extremely similar. And I would like to go through all the similarities and also some of the differences that might make it so it's like, okay, I could see why you would enjoy one and not the other. And then I'll go over, there are a couple things where I'm like, okay, Vorkosigan is distinctly better in this way, or Dresden is distinctly better in this way. And then at the end, because I know you want me to, I will tell you which I like more. So the first thing that makes these similar is just the combination of being very good while being fast-paced and readable. A lot of my favorite series are reasonably slow-paced, or might have, a lot of characters, and you might, if you're not someone who's used to that, be intimidated by it and feel like you have to take notes, or that they might take like a long time to read because they're very long books. Because, you might notice some of them might also be like extremely large books. But both the Dresden Files and the Vorkosigan Saga have a lot of books, but those books are very short. Well, not very short relative to like not fantasy books, but very short relative to fantasy books. And sci-fi is a little shorter, but you know what I mean. Relative to the books that I was just holding up, they're very short. And also both of them, like almost all the books, start very quickly. They're very easy to get into. They're just on a page-by-page level, very readable in that, like, they just aren't obtuse in terms of difficulty. And, sometimes I love a difficult book, but I need to be in a particular headspace if I'm going to sit down and read Book of the New Sun or Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I don't want to read that always, because then my brain will get tired. And these books, without sacrificing quality, both series do not make my brain tired. I don't need to struggle to remember who people are. And I don't need to, I won't be reading one of the books for 15 days and be like, oh my god, this book is 1,100 pages. They also, I think, are very clearly both very story focused. Like, I think both authors would be like, character and story is first, and they both have very it's unobtrusive thematic exploration. But the thing is, it's not bad thematic exploration. Like, Dresden Files has been something I've read for a long time, and is one of the series that has changed me as a person a reasonable amount, even compared to other stuff that I started reading at the same time. And I think both series, if I think of them in my head, how strong they are thematically, they get very strong grades for that. But for both of them, the thematic exploration is extremely out of the way compared to, hey, there's conflict, we need to resolve that conflict. How are we going to do that? they also have an advantage for going into them in that, like, when you look at a long series like The Wheel of Time, each book is like a direct continuation of the after, and they will all kind of have endings-ish, but like you don't want to take a multi-year break between Wheel of Time novels because it's like a continuation of the same series. Also, you'll forget all the Aes Sedais whose names start with S. But both Dresden and Vorkosigan are episodic in nature while also having excellent long-term storytelling. So like each book you can read reasonably on its own. Now, obviously, if you read them out of order, they'll like spoil other books and you'll miss stuff. But in terms of like on reread, I could read any Dresden book except for Peace Talks and any Vorkosigan book and be like, yup, that was a story. It had an end, it had an introduction, it had an inciting incident, it had a resolution. I am satisfied by what I have just read. So it's very easy to take breaks. You don't have to rush through them. You can kind of just like start either series and be like, that was a great time. And then you're in the mood for something a little meatier. And then, you know, you don't read them for a few months. And then you continue and it's not a problem. They also, both just in terms of like how they go between books, they have time skips in a very similar way where you follow both main characters over like a long course of years. I think we've so far seen more years from Miles, but probably by the end we'll have seen more years from Dresden. But most of the books will be about like a short period of time. Dresden books tend to be a little more compact. Like Dresden books typically follow between 1 and 4 days, while there are more Vorkosigan books that take like a month. But you are going to have like, it's essentially never going to happen where one book ends and then there's like the next book begins like the minute after, except for Peace Talks and Battleground. They also, I think in terms of style, like while you're reading them, feel similar because you have a very similar level of psychic distance. They both are very deep into the main character's head in terms of character voice. Like this is not like the abridged story. This is like if you were in a scene, you were going to get all the stuff that the main character was thinking about in that scene. And they also treat their supporting cast very similarly, where they both have an extremely well-developed and somewhat large supporting cast, but not large enough that you need to like take notes to remember them. And for both of them, like each novel will take the people from the supporting cast who make sense for the story and have them, and like leave most of the supporting cast on the bench. And then like they'll come in only for the books that they're in, and every time they come back, like they feel fresh. And it's worth noting that I'm going to talk about this later, but both just have like one of my all-time favorite protagonists, which is one of the similarities. And also both the protagonists have like, they're not the same personality-wise because they're very distinct characters, but they're both have a great combination of serious and fun. And also, I think both authors are really good at building in long-term storytelling with the episodic nature, where there will be like, you know, multi-book arcs and like entire series-long arcs, and the consequences don't go away, even though the books are episodic in nature. Like, you can't read them in any order because if stuff happens and there are consequences, we don't just get to forget about those consequences. So there's tension and there's stakes the entire time. And they also both kind of start with somewhat familiar world building. Shards of Honor feels, which is the first Vorkosigan novel, feels very Star Trek-y, where it's, in terms of aesthetic, like reasonably basic sci-fi, where it's like, you've seen this enough before that you can fill in the gaps. Like, there's a stunner and the phase disruptor. It's like, okay, it's a phaser on kill and a phaser on stun. It like, one kills people, one stuns people. You don't need the novel to explain this to you. You can like fill in the gap, and it's familiar enough that it's like a very fast learning curve. It's not a steep learning curve at all. And the same for Dresden. It's urban fantasy. It's set in Chicago, and it's like, hey, you can probably guess there's going to be vampires. Like, you know roughly what the vampires are going to be like. There's going to be the winter court. They're probably going to be wintry. They both have enough of a reliance to start out on stuff that you know from consuming other pieces of fiction, that even though the worlds end up being very complex, they're not extremely difficult to get into, and they're able to accomplish this without really ever having to just drop exposition, but more relying on like the context that you already have. And finally, very, very importantly for similarity, the name of both series is the last name of the main character followed by a word that means a collection of stories. Like, so, but for those who don't know, probably a lot of these similarities are deliberate from Jim Butcher's standpoint, because Louis Bujold is Jim Butcher's favorite living author. So probably, I'm pretty sure he loved Louis Bujold before he started the Dresden Files, and it's like, this is the type of story he likes, so he probably was like, that is, in terms of strengths, in terms of feel, probably what he's going for. And I do wonder if he was like, Vorkosigan Saga, Dresden Files. It just works. But obviously, they are not the same, because some people are watching this and are like, well, I've read both, Jake, and I like Vorkosigan but not Dresden, and I like Dresden and not Vorkosigan. So what gives? If they're the same, why do I like one and not the other? That's fair. You're not wrong. I'm a hypothetical person. You do not need to leave an angry comment. I promise. I acknowledge your existence. So there are some differences. The main one is just the difference in genre and aesthetic. Like, the main reason, if you were someone who has only read one, that I would, like, not tell you to go read the other is, I mean, one is a sci-fi and one is, like, a noir urban fantasy. So if you're like, I'm a huge fan of urban fantasy or noir, and I like Dresden because I like urban fantasy or noir, or I'm a huge fan of sci-fi, and I think books about magic are silly, and I don't like it when I don't really want to read about wizards and vampires and werewolves and fairies, then valid. You know what? Because even if it's told in a narratively similar way, if you don't want to read about vampires, it's going to have vampires, so you're not going to like it. And if you don't want to read about science-y stuff, which Vorkosigan is not hard, it's very... well, when it has technical stuff, the technical stuff I think is good. So I think, like, if you're a science-y or an engineering person, you'll probably enjoy that about it. But you don't need to follow any of the science, and it's not about the science, it's about the story and character. But anyway, if you don't like sci-fi, then yeah, you won't like Vorkosigan because it's sci-fi. The other main difference, which this is more of a reason to not enjoy the Dresden Files, is just stylistically, Dresden Files very infamously has a male gaze, where Harry, especially, is a noir character, and all of the women are extremely hot in the Dresden Files, like all of them. So if that is gonna be a problem for you, like if you just don't want to read from that perspective. I guess theoretically someone could just not like reading from Miles' perspective, but that's a little weirder. Like, I could see someone just disagreeing me about the quality of Miles' character because it's inherently subjective, and not finding him as interesting as I do. But I don't think anyone's gonna read Miles' perspective and be like, this is like a weird, icky perspective to read from. While I think it's, you know, a thing that you have seen. If you can go on the internet, people can read Dresden and be like, it's kind of an icky perspective to read. I just don't like being in this person's head. So I think that is honestly, like, the most substantial reason why someone would enjoy one and not the other. It's also one point that's like, I think, while both have a good amount of action and both are quite fast-paced, Dresden is more uniform from book to book in terms of the amount of action and the speed of the book. While Vorkosigan might have, like, a quite fast book in Shards of Honor, and then, like, a slower book in Barrayar, and then a very fast book in Warrior's Apprentice, and, like, you know, later on you might get... There's quite a bit more variety, and you might get, like, you know, some books that are, like, action thrillers. There's some books there is not an action scene in the entire thing. If you open a Dresden book... Now, there are some that have, like, less action. Like, you know, Battleground has a lot more violence in it than Ghost Story, but it's a lot more uniform. So if you're a huge, like, thriller action-y person, there might be more variance like, you might just not enjoy some Vorkosigan novels as much. One thing that's just a stylistic difference that I don't think is gonna like push that many people off is Dresden Files is all from the perspective of Harry Dresden, with the exception of like a couple short stories. Vorkosigan is like mostly Miles. I think probably by the end it's like, I'd guess 60%. That's a pure vibe check guess that like 60% of the words are from Miles' point of view. It might be higher than that, might be a little lower. That's just a guess. While Dresden is like 98%, even including the short stories. One thing that also, Dresden Files versus Vorkosigan, like the Dresden tends to have a bit more ramp up, and they're more back heavy in terms of the final half. Where for Dresden, the term now is like the Sanderland, but Dresden will tend to ramp up to a greater degree of chaos and have a more extended final act in terms of how long the final act is. One thing is just for the main character we're following, Miles is much smarter than Harry. Harry can be clever and resourceful at times, and Miles can make bad decisions, but like, one of the appeals of the Vorkosigan saga is how smart of a character Miles is, and how we're shown that and don't have to be told, and like getting enjoyment from watching Miles outsmart people. It's very satisfying. Now, Harry outsmarts people sometimes, but it's kind of like a novel plot point when he does. And then on the opposite side, like Harry has a lot more personal power. Harry is a wizard. He can shoot fireballs. Miles cannot. So some people might want to read about or not read about someone who's able to just directly solve problems with violence. Also, Harry's a lot taller. For those who have read both, I'm not going to say how much taller Harry is because I want you to read both. If you've read neither, I want you to read both and see the difference. And if you've read one, I want you to guess how much taller Harry is. If you've only read one and you don't know, I want you to guess the height difference in the comments in feet and inches. And they're both just human in terms of height. So I just want you to guess and we'll see how close you get. Another difference as you go through is Dresden has continually escalated in stakes throughout the series. Like, Stormfront is distinctly the smallest novel. And it's not every novel isn't necessarily higher stakes than the previous novel, but there's a very, very, very clear general trend up, and it's building towards an ending that's supposed to be a wrap-up of the entire story. Well, Vorkosigan kind of peaks in terms of stakes of, like, in books 9 or 10, and then there's more variety. Like, you might get, like, a high stakes, fate of the world on the line stakes, and then, a book later, you might get a book that's just, like, solve the murder of one person. Or, like, there's literally a book, the last one, that's kind of weird, which is basically about someone making a career decision. Which would you would never get, and that's the last one. So, by Dresden standards, by the time they get to the last one, it's going to be something called the Big Apocalyptic Trilogy. There is no Big Apocalyptic Trilogy for Vorkosigan. Vorkosigan kind of just ends. Bujold could write more. She could write one more book. She could write 5 more books. She could write 0 more books. We don't know. So it might be done. It might not be. But it's not like it's building towards one final act while Dresden is. And a final difference is that you need a flow chart to figure out the reading order for Vorkosigan. Just start with Shards of Honor, okay? Just start with Shards of Honor and Barrier. Just read those 2 first, and then Warrior's Apprentice. Whatever. There also are differences that are not stylistic differences that are, one of the series is just better at than the other. So let's do Vorkosigan first. And this is the biggest difference between, like, the biggest advantage Vorkosigan has, very simply, is that the Vorkosigan books are good right away. While Shards of Honor is one of the weaker Vorkosigan books, Barrier, which is book 2, is excellent, and, like, the gap between Shards of Honor and the really good Vorkosigan books, I'll die on this, is so much smaller than the gap between Stormfront and the first Dresden books. Very famously, the first few Dresden books are just much weaker than the rest of the series. And so if you're like, what are the 4 worst novels of both series? I'm like, well, Stormfront, Full Moon, and Blood Rights, and probably Grave Peril are just like Stormfront is just worse than every Vorkosigan novel. So Dresden requires more trust, because like you have to be like, you know, if you're like, I read it and it was pretty good, I guess, everyone's going to be like, no, it gets so much better. And everyone is telling you the truth, which is the frustrating part, because then you'll read it and then you'll try and tell people and they won't believe you. But, you know, there is this thing where if you strongly dislike Dresden to the point where like it's very unlikely you would actually like it, because obviously like some people read Changes and don't like it. Like, it's not a universally 5-star book. And if you are the person who dislikes Dresden enough that you would give Changes 1 or 2 stars, people are still going to tell you to keep going, and that might annoy you. Well, Vorkosigan, after 2 books, you basically know because it's good right away. And one thing I mentioned earlier in terms of variety, I do think Bejoled is able to write a greater variety of genre and plot structures, where, like, you know, some books might be action thrillers, some books might be mysteries, some books, there's a comedy of manners, Pride and Prejudice style book, there might be a book that's, like, technically in terms of structure, a romance, but, like, in a way that, like, you don't think of it as a typical romance novel as you read it. There's like slow burn investigation novel. They're like, Bejoled will just write whatever genre she wants. While, I mean, Dresden, there's a general change throughout the series as they start as more detective procedural, but the detective is a wizard, and they verge their way into epic fantasy. That's a steady shift. Well, for Vorkosigan, it's like, you don't know what genre of the book you're going to be. And I'm considering that a strength because Bejoled has the ability to write every genre, and Butcher has not shown that he does. Now, you could, I guess, stylistically consider that a weakness, but whatever. I do think Vorkosigan is also plotted tighter. Not necessarily better, but I think there are, like, they both try and be character-driven in terms of, like, its characters' decisions driving what happens. But sometimes Jim clearly doesn't. He said this. He's been like, what do you do when you don't know what to do? And he's like, well, I have a bad guy kick open the door with a gun. Bejoled does not have the bad guy kick open a door with a gun. Like, it's a very character-driven story, and there'll be scenes that you read that feel like they're there for no reason, and then, oh, they have a plot-relevant reason. There's definitely, like, they're both pretty tight in that they're reasonably short, trim novels. But there are definitely more scenes that are not plot relevant in the Dresden novels. I also, as an extension of the male gaze thing for Strength of Vorkosigan, I think even, like, the fans of Dresden, like the mega fans of Dresden, like myself would admit, Dresden just has some moments that are cringy, that just make you cringe. Yes, I'm talking about scenes like late in Full Moon. Like, it just does. It's just a part of the series that makes it harder to recommend, because whenever I recommend Dresden to someone, I think of them reading the cringe scenes. Now, Vorkosigan doesn't have no cringe scenes, but it definitely has way less cringe scenes. And that is a strength, and that is a main reason why it's like, it feels more recommendable. And I do think, probably in terms of character conception, the Vorkosigan saga is stronger. Now, in terms of, like, execution, I think Dresden has amazingly good characters. But if we compare, like, wizard to detective versus... I'm actually not going to say the conception of Miles, like, what the premise of Miles is, because it's kind of a plot point of Barrayar, and it's kind of a spoiler. But, like, the origin of the characters on average, I think, is more distinctive from other characters you will read in Vorkosigan than it is in the Dresden Files. But alas, the Dresden Files can hit back, because Dresden also has some advantages. And in my opinion, the biggest one by far is the emotional intensity of the final acts. Vorkosigan, probably the biggest reason it's like a Vorkosigan novel will not be my favorite novel of all time is a lot of the time the struggle and conflict ends a lot more abruptly. While Dresden, you get these, like, glorious final acts of, like, absolute maximum emotional intensity, and I think Jim gives you a greater feel of struggle before getting to the resolution without feeling drawn out. And so I think often, like, the moment of victory. So obviously the main character is like, when you're reading it, like, it's the Dresden Files. The next book's also going to have Dresden. And it's the Vorkosigan Saga. If you were reading the first book from the perspective of Miles Vorkosigan, he's not going to die. Like, he's going to be in the second book. So while you're reading it, like, you know he's not going to die. But this was all being like, the books are going to have a moment of victory. And I find the moment of victory is just often much more emotionally satisfying, and also sometimes more pyrrhic, and gets generally more emotionally intense for Dresden. I think, as a strength for plotting, I think Jim is also, this is a second Dresden advantage, I think Jim is better at the dramatic reveal twists of, like, you know, the feeling where it's like, oh my god, how did I not see that coming? That's so obvious in hindsight. But I was just like, I missed that the entire time, right in front, like, it was right in front of my face. Now, it's worth noting, he has, like, no really good one of these until, like, book 6 or 7, and then, like, almost all the books have an amazing one. And I think, you know, if I do the top 10 dramatic reveals or twists from both series, probably 8 or 9 are from Dresden. I think Jim is just better than that. I also do think the Dresden world building is distinctly better. I think it's more unique. It more stands out. It adds more to the enjoyment. Dresden world building, like, almost all of these things start worse for Dresden, because, again, the biggest advantage of Vorkosigan is that, like, Stormfront is just worse than every Vorkosigan novel, in my opinion. But for the, you know, meat of Dresden, I do think world building is a strength. And I think also the ability to build and control scale is a strength. I know I talked about this as a stylistic difference, but I also do think it's an advantage from a storytelling standpoint to very slowly and steadily build up the stakes and scale while maintaining the field of maintaining it being grounded, maintaining the tension the entire time. And I think those are the main advantages of Dresden. I also think if I had to pick, I do prefer Jim Butcher's action to Lois Bajol's action, just in terms of, like, intensity and engagement. But I do think they're both quite good action writers. But I do want to just mention, like, this was part of their similarities, but I want to mention that both, just in terms of strengths, I couldn't put these as strengths for either because they're so strong for both. And that is have a truly all-time great protagonist. Like, Miles and Harry are literally 2 of my 3 favorite fictional characters ever. They are both completely amazing in terms of concept, development, relationships, voice. They're both just incredibly deep. They both have the feeling of being a real person while being unlike any other real person I know. And they also just are both such strong personalities. Like, in terms of dialogue and just in terms of being, like, you know, you could pick out a line of dialogue or internal monologue from either of them. Like, more than almost any other character I've read. And I just can't emphasize enough. Now, it is like, I guess, the first book that you read for Vorkosigan doesn't have Miles in it. And for the first couple books of Dresden you read, Harry is not an all-time protagonist. So for both, you have to wait a little bit for the all-time protagonist. But I do think they both, in their entirety, have some of the best written fictional characters that I have ever encountered. And they also both have an extremely excellent supporting cast. I think for both, the protagonist is a bigger strength. But it's also like, Jim and Bajol are 2 of the best character writers that I have read. And so the supporting cast is also a strength. And, like, for both, the, like, relationship web between the supporting cast is extremely strong. And ultimately, the thing they both have that puts them in their own category in my mind is being maximum in terms of the fun page-turning factor while also maintaining insanely high levels of underlying depth and quality. So, that was 30 minutes of comparison. So the question is, you want to know, which do I like more? The answer is Dresden. So it's close, but ultimately it comes down to I like my favorite Dresden book more than I like my favorite Vorkosigan book. I like my second favorite Dresden book more than my second favorite Vorkosigan book. I like my third favorite Dresden book more than my third favorite Vorkosigan book. And that is true for the entire top 7. Now, beyond that point, it flips, and I prefer the Vorkosigan book for the rest, but I care slightly more about how high the highs are than how low the lows are. So I personally slightly prefer the Dresden Files, probably because it's able to hit higher highs in the final act climaxes, and that is able to push the peak Dresden books beyond the peak Vorkosigan books for me. I also think Vorkosigan is I can probably recommend more universally to people that I know. Like, I think there's less to not like about Vorkosigan, but I do think if you are a huge fan of one, that it is very likely you can be a huge fan of the other. And I think if you're a huge fan of one and the other is on your TBR as a curiosity, I would highly encourage you to move it up. I hope you enjoyed the video. Even though if anyone had watched my previous versus videos, you might have been slightly baited by the title. But if you want, eventually when I do another Q&A, you can ask me, hey, Dresden versus Vorkosigan with your normal format, and I'll do it for you. Let me know in the comments below. I have questions for all of the varying people. If you've read neither, was this convincing you to read both? If you read neither, and this was convincing, which did you become more convinced to read? I am curious about that. If you've read one of them, did this convince you to read the other? And if you've read both, do you think I'm right that they have massive cross appeal? Have a good day, everyone.